run high as South Africans take to the streets to stand up against crime. George W. Bush finds his rhythm trying to win over the youth of Latin America.
There's the kick.
And the Bulls sizzle in Sydney with a resounding win against the Waratahs. This is E-News Prime Time. A very good evening. South Africans have taken to the streets to stand up against crime. Victims of crime and concerned citizens marched in Johannesburg, Cape Town and Durban to demand government take action to stop the scourge.
One of the many victims of crime in South Africa. This woman's lost both her husband and father in two separate incidents of violent crime.
My child was 6 years old. He's grown up without a father.
Crime has dominated the headlines in recent weeks, from the murder of historian David Rattray in KwaZulu-Natal to the death of little Shaldine Human in Gauteng just this week. Today, a handful of people took to the streets of the nation's major cities to demand action. The turnout might not be as high as organisers had expected, but those who did attend had strong words for government. Some came just to show their support for victims of crime, but many have themselves been directly affected in one way or another.
Well, in 2000 I was hijacked. My car was riddled with bullets. Just last year in August, a guy pulled a gun out in my back at my workplace.
My mom was sat next to a taxi driver who was shot 7 times. I've had my partner who's also been hijacked. One of the bullets just missed him, went into his headrest. 3 weeks ago, one of my colleagues' sister, her car was just hijacked. I've had another colleague who was sitting in a house with her husband when guys broke in.
In Johannesburg, marchers wore pink ribbons in solidarity with victims of crime. They handed over a petition to the mayor's office calling for an end to violence. A dismal turnout in Durban didn't stop a handful of marchers taking to the streets. And a similar situation in Cape Town, where fewer than 100 protesters marched, descending on Parliament, armed with a petition and memorandum, appealing for a crime and corruption-free South Africa. Robin Smith, E-News, Cape Town.
Well, police in Gauteng have made a breakthrough in the grisly murder of a Meyerton florist. Willie Slubbert was stabbed to death on his farm last month. Police have arrested 3 suspects, but community members say 2 of them were out on parole when the murder took place.
For over a decade, Willie Slubbert's Meyerton home has been a popular wedding venue, making his murder last month all the more painful for this tight-knit community. Slubbert was found stabbed to death here in his kitchen. The apparent motive? Robbery. Now police have arrested 3 suspects, 2 of them just 19 years old.
2 of them have actually grown up in the area. They've been employed in various places in the area, and they're fairly well known in the area.
According to Slubbert's neighbours, at least 2 of the suspects are out on parole for other crimes.
It concerns us that they have been in prison and they have been let out. And as a result, this murder has taken place.
Police could not confirm whether any of these suspects had been convicted for other crimes, but say that will form part of their investigation. While the community says they feel slightly reassured by the arrests of the 3 suspects, they hope the courts will consider the rights of Willie Slubbert and not just his alleged killers when the trial eventually does get underway. Kale Naya, E-News, Meyerton.
Speaking of prisons, Correctional Services is at war with Parliament's Prisons Committee. The committee has rejected the department's report into the escape of Mozambican Ananias Mate last year. Correctional Services says he squeezed through a tiny hole in his cell at CMAX prison. But Parliament believes Mate may have bribed his way out. Now Correctional Services says the committee is guilty of weak political leadership.
Correctional Services Minister Nqonde Belfour is in charge of nearly 160,000 prisoners in South Africa and wields a budget of more than 10 billion rand. But Parliament's Prisons Committee has embarrassed Balfour by utterly rejecting his report into the jailbreak of Mozambican Ananias Mate. Now the report will be tabled in the National Assembly, where chances are it will be ripped to shreds again and then thrown out.
Thank you.
Minister Balfour has refused to comment, but it's hard to see how the committee's findings could be anything other than a snub. And it's just the latest in a long line of embarrassments for the minister. His department has recently been accused of showing favouritism to prisoners Tony Yengeni and Shabir Sheikh. Both have strong ANC connections. Yengeni is out on parole now, but when he arrived to serve a 4-year sentence for fraud, Balfour was part of a crowd that carried him shoulder high into prison.
Viva African National Congress! Viva! Viva!
Last week, Parliament also accused correctional services of squandering money and gross overspending for the 4th year in a row. A costly system to tag prisoners and prevent prison escapes has also failed. Escapes are still common. Minister Balfour recently told Parliament that correctional services management will be revamped and will now be directly accountable to him. He's promised a clean-up operation in correctional services, but many South Africans may be thinking they've heard all of this before. Ben said, E-News, Johannesburg.
In other news, Eastern Cape residents have started to rebuild their homes after a devastating storm hit the area last week. Torrential rains and strong winds flattened houses and caused widespread flooding. At least 14 people died.
A week on, and residents of this rural Eastern Cape enclave are counting the costs. They pick through the wreckage of their homes, trying to salvage what they can and rebuild. Gale force winds and heavy rains lashed the area last week, flattening houses and killing 14 people. This primary school bore the full force of the storm. The result, extensive damage to the admin block and an entire classroom torn down. Now the school's youngest learners are getting taught outside, at the mercy of the elements. Local authorities say it'll cost millions to repair the storm damage, and the figure is rising by the day.
It's a huge loss indeed, but we're trying by all means to make sure that people, especially those who are affected, are able to get food.
With the flood victims' immediate needs catered for, the municipality will now consider the rebuilding effort and might have to ask provincial government for financial help to do so.
Well, still ahead on E-News Prime Time, the US shares a room with 2 members of the so-called Axis of Evil as a historic summit begins in Baghdad. Another missing child is found murdered, this time her